This is the only Jack the Ripper book you should read. Can't see what it is? You might have to watch more of the video then. Hello, I'm Tim and I have too many books. Some months ago I was out on a book buying expedition and I found this book. Now I bought this book because I recognised this guy. This guy is an actor called Stratford Johns, and he was in a television programme called Softly Softly Task Force. I think he was also in a predecessor television programme called Z-Cars back in the 1960s. Now, I knew Stratford Johns not just because he was an actor or because he was in Softly Softly Task Force, but because he was in a television series about Jack the Ripper. This one. Now, in this series, Stratford Johns and Frank Windsor play their characters from Softly Softly Task Force, Chief Superintendent Brownlow and Chief Superintendent Watt. In the television series, these were two detectives of similar rank who butted heads quite a lot. They were both of equal rank, but Stratford Johns' Chief Superintendent Barlow was had more seniority than Frank Windsor's Chief Superintendent Watt. This slightly combative relationship between the two detectives comes out in this television series where they investigate the Ripper murders using dramatisations and also original documents. This was made in 1973, ran for 6 episodes, and surprisingly, the more I delve into it, is very, very influential on Ripper thought. It popularised several Ripper theories which have taken the world by storm. Now, before sinking into the bottomless pit of Ripperology, it's probably worth talking about this phenomenon that represented by this television programme, which is fictional detectives investigating a real case. Now, obviously, this is a slightly niche genre because either the case has already been solved, in which case you're having your fictional detective stealing a real detective's glory, or you are investigating an unsolved case, in which case you either have to leave the solution open-ended, or you have to fictionalise the original case and in order for it to be solved. Probably the best known example of a fictional detective taking on a real-life mystery is Josephine Tay's The Daughter of Time. In this, she puts her Detective Inspector Alan Grant into hospital where he's very bored and starts to look into the murders of the princes in the Tower, which is apparently instigated by Richard III. Now, what she does is present a very good case to say that it might not have been Richard III, but she doesn't come to any definite conclusions because there are no definite conclusions. There are plenty of people who think Richard III did it, and there are plenty of people who think Richard III didn't do it. But she, like I said, she makes a very good case for the idea that Richard III didn't need to kill the princes in the Tower and therefore probably didn't. Another detective writer to do this was Colin Dexter in The Wench is Dead. In that one, he puts his detective, Inspector Morse, into hospital, and Inspector Morse begins to look into a 19th century murder on the canals around Oxford. Now, in that particular one, he has to fictionalise the ending in order to give Inspector Morse a win, in order to get Inspector Morse to solve the crime. In much the same way, when Messrs Barlow and Watt investigate the Ripper murders, they can't come to a firm conclusion, but like I said, they do popularise one or two theories that have become very important. And those are theories about Masonic and or royal ties to the murders. A little bit about the Ripper murders in case you don't know that much about them. In a 10-week period between late August and early November 1888, 5 women were murdered in and around the Whitechapel area of London, in a very small geographical area. 4 of these women were poor alcoholic women in their mid-40s. It is alleged that all of the victims were prostitutes, although there's only firm evidence for 2 of the women being prostitutes. The others are labelled as casual prostitutes, which is really guesswork based on the idea that, well, they were poor and living in that area, they probably indulged in prostitution. There is no firm evidence that they were, though. What typifies the murders is that these women had their throats cut in a very vicious and determined way. It's not so much frenzied as the cuts were extremely deep. In one case, almost decapitating the woman and cutting through to the spinal column. Another common factor in the murders is either an attempted evisceration or a full evisceration. In a couple of cases, body parts were removed. To a lot of people, this suggested some kind of medical knowledge or some kind of anatomical knowledge, so either a doctor or a butcher or slaughterman. Although this is somewhat contentious, and lots of people said, well, anybody could have done it. But certainly the way that these women were killed does show a certain determination and a knowledge of how to kill efficiently and viciously. And that's more to do, and that has more of a feeling of somebody who's used to slaughtering animals than it is somebody who has to save lives or cut up bodies, like a doctor. One of the things that people have noticed about the deaths is some people feel that the killings were in some way staged in order to give clues about certain Masonic rites. The way that the intestines on one victim were displayed, the things that they held in their hands, and also a nearby piece of graffiti which either relates to the Jews or to a group of people known as the JUWES, who were the name for the three murderers of the architect of Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem. And that is a root of the Masonic beliefs, is all about Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem. So lots of people say this is all to do with the Masons, and it's a joke again. And a lot of it is, the whole series of murders might be a sort of macabre attack on the Masons and Masonic ritual. That would suggest somebody who is very well connected. The problem with solving these crimes comes down to the fact that although they're in a very small geographical area, there are 2 different police divisions and 3 different coroner's courts that looked into these murders. Also, the coroner's records were destroyed in the Second World War by German bombing. This means that we only have newspaper reports to go on for a lot of the investigation. We don't have full investigations on things, so there's an awful lot of speculation that still goes on about these murders. It does seem, though, that the police wanted the perpetrator to be an immigrant, possibly living locally. Certainly whoever did it had to have had pretty good local knowledge, because they were able to disappear into the crowd. This mitigates against some kind of posh person slumming in the East End. Locals, of course, wanted it to be an outsider, and again, possibly a posh person slumming it. For me, the major question that you have to ask about the Whitechapel murders is why they started and why they stopped. And once you've answered those questions, you might have a better idea of who did them. Another thing to point out is that although there are 5 what's known as canonical murders, there are another 6 murders which happened both before and after this 10-week period that might have been associated with the Ripper. But there's just enough difference between those murders and the canonical murders that they're not always included. In reading more about this, one of the things that has struck me is how that everybody wants to label these women as prostitutes. Now, I've already said that, intimated perhaps, that I rather don't trust that labelling of them. And this is largely due to this book. This is The Five by Hallie Rubenhold, in which she traces the life story of the 5 canonical victims of Jack the Ripper. She really doesn't deal with the crimes or how they were committed or what people said about them after they were dead. She really takes them up to the last time these women were seen alive. But she does introduce some ideas that would be very problematic to most Ripperologists. And the principal idea is that, as I said, there's limited evidence for 3 of these women, 3 of these alcoholic, poor women in their mid-40s being prostitutes. Now, it's quite possible that somebody would commit sex acts for small amounts of money just to keep the wolf from the door, but there is little evidence for it. These women seem to have been trying to keep themselves together by piecework, by domestic work, and not indulging in sex work. Lots of their friends said no, they had nothing to do with prostitution, but a lot of the press wanted them all to be prostitutes. And a lot of Ripperologists want them all to be prostitutes because that means that they can come up with an elaborate theory where the Ripper had an animus against prostitution, against prostitutes, against loose women. Of course, if they're not all prostitutes, then your Ripper theory goes out of the window. In fact, probably 90% of Ripper theories go out of the window if they're not prostitutes. Hallie Rubenhold goes further to suggest that these three women who probably weren't prostitutes, or she claims were definitely not prostitutes, were also probably sleeping rough in quiet, secluded areas around Whitechapel. Lots of people were sleeping rough at the time. They couldn't afford, if you couldn't afford fourpence to go to a doss house or a rooming house, to get a bed for the night, you would have to sleep in the streets, and you'd find a quiet, secluded place to sleep, hopefully unmolested. And of course, these women were very much molested. And the idea that they may have been attacked while they sleep actually fits with some of the descriptions of both the way they were killed and the fact that they didn't cry out. There's a certain amount of medical evidence that suggests that the women had their throats cut when they were lying down. Well, of course, if you're asleep, you're lying down, but you would probably cry out if somebody knocked you over. So, and there would probably be evidence of some kind of struggle if that happened. But if they're rough sleepers, it changes the Ripper's motivation. Always assuming that they're all killed by the same person. Now, whether or not you believe Hallie Rubenhold's idea, even if you reject that idea, this book, The Five, is very important in piecing out the lives of these women. Because even if they were prostitutes, even if they did do sex acts for money, they're still valuable people. They still, nothing they did in their lives should have led to them being murdered. They didn't deserve it. And far too often we use prostitutes as sort of disposable people. Yeah, they somehow deserve to be murdered. There are jokes about hookers under the bed in Las Vegas and stuff like that. You get far too many jokes. Prostitutes are very often this sort of disposable section of society where it really doesn't matter if they get murdered by somebody. And also, Hallie Rubenhold's book puts a very good counterpoint against the idiots in Ripperology who refer to Jack the Ripper as Saucy Jack, as if what he did wasn't a crime, wasn't a terrible thing to do by somebody who was completely sick. Hallie Rubenhold recreates the lives of these women and shows you their worth. Even if they're poor and drunk and, had lives of misery, they were still important to tell their story. And I think if more people who did investigate Ripperology looked into these women's stories and thought about the reality of these women rather than painting them up as painted Jezebel prostitutes, which they are often depicted as, and they're often depicted as a lot younger than the mid-40s that four of them were, you would get a different picture of your Ripperology, your picture of who the Ripper might have been would be very different. And I think that that's a very important thing, not just because you need to know about these women's lives, but you also need to understand why they may have been targeted and why they may have died. And if Hallie Rubenhold, like I said, if Hallie Rubenhold's right about three of them being rough sleepers and being targeted because they were rough sleeping, then your Ripperology theory goes out of the window. One of the things that made me dip my toe into Ripperology, and it is a fast-moving stream or a bottomless pit or a gripping mire, was this book. This is They All Love Jack, Busting the Ripper by Bruce Robinson. Bruce Robinson is a writer and film director, also occasionally an actor, and he's a fascinating man. He wrote and directed the film With an L and I, which is an absolute classic. And he spent about 14 years putting this chonky boy together, this story of somebody who may have been Jack the Ripper. It's oddly enough somebody who's never been mentioned before. It is a man called Michael Maybrick. Michael Maybrick was the brother of another Ripper suspect called James Maybrick. And James Maybrick, rather infamously, is supposed to have written the Ripper Diary, which is Jack the Ripper's supposed diary, which may or may not be fake, but we'll get to that one later because we will be talking about that. This is a very angry book. Bruce Robinson puts across a very good case for James Maybrick, but if I'm going to criticise it, it's, well, He relies an awful lot on anonymous letters, and hundreds of those letters were sent to them. We're not entirely sure how Bruce Robinson, I'm not entirely clear reading this book exactly how Bruce Robinson picked the letters and chose what letters to include and what letters to discard. But he puts across a very good case whenever he does include a letter that this may have been sent by his favoured Jack the Ripper candidate. It's a very convincing case, like I said. It's full of anger and bitterness against the British establishment and the way people were treated, and really enjoys the idea that this is somebody tweaking the nose of the establishment and all those Masons and all those royal connected people. It doesn't really explain why he stopped. In fact, that's where it kind of loses puff. It has to do with his brother James Maybrick, and in fact, Michael Maybrick appears to be led by a hatred of James Maybrick's wife, Florence Maybrick. Now, again, I'll talk a bit more about James Maybrick when we come to him a little bit later. But it's, like I said, it's a very well put together book, a very well researched book. He spent about 14 years doing it. But I'm not entirely certain that it's true or right. But I did enjoy reading this book. I mean, it's not, like I said, you should only read the 5 if you want to dip your toe into Ripperology. But this is really quite an entertaining read because of its the style, the anger, and a pretty good and convincing idea of who the Ripper might have been. Now, of course, if you want to get further into Ripperology, it's probably best to have a couple of decent source books, a couple of decent reference books for Ripperology. I picked a couple. I've read one of them, and the other one is really a reference book, so I've only flicked through it. But a good source book appears to be Jack the Ripper A to Z, which is written by Paul Begg, Martin Fido, and Keith Skinner. This book tries to put together all the facts and sources for the Ripper murders. It's basically in alphabetical order. So if you want to look up a street name, you look up, you find the appropriate place. If you want to find a name of a person, it's all going to be alphabetically done. Like any Ripperology book, it is going to have a bias towards certain ideas of Ripperology. It's going to emphasize some facts and de-emphasize others, but it appears to be a pretty comprehensive guide. Now, the reason I picked this one and not any other sort of Ripperology source book is because of one particular person, and that is Martin Fido. Martin Fido used to present a radio programme called Murders After Midnight on LBC, the London's talk radio station, in the 1990s. And it was a very entertaining story. He seemed very level-headed. He seemed to not only know what he was talking about, but not really be too sensationalist about things, a lot of understanding of the basic humanity of people. So he is somebody I've thought worth listening to when it comes to the Ripperology, although it has to be said, Bruce Robinson doesn't give him a very good time in his book, so yes. But this A to Z is a pretty good read, pretty good fact book, just as a source book for all the information you need. If you find something about the Ripper, there'll probably be an entry in this book for it. The next book to think about is the Mammoth Book of Jack the Ripper, which is edited by Maxim Jakubowski. In this book, the editor gets together about 20 different accounts, different views of the Ripper murders. Each person has to write an essay of a couple of thousand words where they put forward their favourite Ripper account, their favourite Ripper candidate, and why they think it is true. And this one is an absolutely fascinating read because you get all of the different possibilities that anybody's ever mentioned, or almost all of the different possibilities that people have mentioned, and it really tells a fascinating story of who it might be, and you can reject or agree with as many candidates as you like. And I certainly, reading this book, I was going, oh yes, it could have been him, or it could have been them, or it could have been him, or it could have been him. And it's almost always a him, by the way. It's very, there are a few people who think it might have been Jill the Ripper rather than Jack the Ripper, but most people think, yes, it was a man, and probably just one man, although, there are lots of conspiracy theories, especially when you get to somebody, some of the sort of the posh people who maybe not have known Whitechapel and needed people to gather in the women for them. Again, what is a flaw in all of these in all of these accounts, and almost all of these accounts, is they simply say, oh yeah, they bust 5 prostitutes, they had no value. Like I said, go back to Hallie Rubenhold. One of the reasons I find Hallie Rubenhold so compelling is because Ripperologists just ignore these women, these victims, who they really were. And they just say, no, they're prostitutes. They're just that disposable section of society. And this is something that is very prevalent in these Ripper stories in this Mammoth book. But again, I think it was very well worth reading, because you get an overview of all of the different theories and all of the different ways of thinking about the murder. There are some very convincing candidates in there. Now, so far I've been talking about non-fiction books about Jack the Ripper, people who are trying to talk based on evidence that they have. This book, well, if it's fact, then this person was definitely Jack the Ripper. But there's a possibility that it's a forgery, and therefore, yeah, this is a work of fiction. We'll have to see. This book is the so-called Diary of Jack the Ripper. This is purported to have been written by James Maybrick, who I've already mentioned. James Maybrick was a Liverpool merchant, a very rich man, and he was poisoned in 1889 apparently by his wife, Florence Maybrick, who went to prison for his murder and was later exonerated. Now, the idea was that she poisoned him with arsenic, although he was already something of an arsenic junkie. The diary appears to have been written in a Victorian, possibly a scrapbook. The first 20 pages of this scrapbook have been removed. Now, it would have been very easy for somebody to pick up a Victorian scrapbook, remove the first 20 pages, and then start writing the diary. The writing style in the diary is fairly Victorian, and it also has changes in style slightly as the mood of the writing or the mood of the writer goes on. It tells a very interesting story. Plenty of people have seen flaws, bits of evidence that weren't known or weren't around, or perhaps have been debunked in this book. Now, the big problem with this book is that of authentication. There's a big problem with the authentication of this diary. Obviously, if you've got a Victorian scrapbook that you're writing the diary in, it would appear Victorian. The only thing you can rely on is the ink. But it's possible that even in the early 1990s, when this diary surfaced, that somebody could have used a Victorian ink formulation to produce, something that looks like Victorian ink. Yeah, somebody's put together some Victorian-looking ink and written the diary, which is, of course, what you do if you wanted to do a decent fake, and also what you do if you were writing a genuine diary. But of course, with ink, you're dealing with something that is put on the surface of the paper. There's very tiny amounts of it, and any trace amounts of sort of nuclear test radiation and anything that might show it is of later manufacture is going to be very difficult to detect, and they might be contaminated by outside means. So it's a very difficult thing to judge the authenticity based on this. The people who are purported to have found the diary, especially as the original owner, has gone back and forth between saying yes, the diary was fake, and no, the diary wasn't. We don't know who to believe. But like I said, if the diary's true, then James Maybrick was almost certainly the Ripper, unless of course you believe Bruce Robinson, in which case his brother Michael faked the diary in order to get back at Florence Maybrick, because she was, in his view, a terrible woman and an adulteress, and was making his brother James's life an absolute hell. We don't know the true story of this, but it is absolutely fascinating. I remember when this diary first came out, a lot of Ripperologists were rather confused by it, because why had they picked Michael Maybrick? I mean, obviously Michael Maybrick case, because it was a notorious murder in the 19th century, but connecting him to the Ripper really confused a lot of Ripperologists. And I think what happened there, perhaps, is that an expert, it wasn't an expert in Jack the Ripper who came up with Michael Maybrick. It was somebody who was an expert in Michael Maybrick who came up with him as a potential candidate for Jack the Ripper. So yeah, they came at it from a different angle. Now, if it was faked, and of course it may or not have been, you really have to read the diary and decide for yourself. The last non-fiction book I'm going to talk about is a book by Patricia Cornwell, published in 2002. Patricia Cornwell is the novelist known for her Case Scarpetta series, and she got very much involved in Ripperology when she wrote a book called A Portrait of a Killer, Jack the Ripper, Case Closed. This came into a lot of criticism. It was widely debunked. She basically claims that the murders were performed by an artist called Walter Sickert. Certainly Walter Sickert was living in the area at the time, and he was very, very fascinated by the Ripper murders. But fascination in murders is not necessarily a confession of guilt. Patricia Cornwell's book was later republished in 2017 as Ripper, The Secret Life of Walter Sickert, in which I think she walks back some of her earlier theories, although she is very determined to prove that it was Walter Sickert who was the Ripper. It's not the first time Walter Sickert was mentioned as the Ripper. He was mentioned as early as 1925 as a possible Ripper suspect. There's a lot of stories that go around about him, so her interest is somewhat justified, I think. I'm going to talk about some of the fictional depictions of these murder cases, or fictionalized depictions of these murder cases. Now, I mentioned before about well-known detectives investigating murder, and of course the best-known detective who was around at the time of the Ripper murders was Sherlock Holmes, and Michael Dibdin wrote a book called The Last Sherlock Holmes Story, where he has Holmes and Watson investigating the crimes and thinking that Moriarty might be behind the Ripper murders, and we find out who truly was behind the Ripper murders in a rather exciting way. Sherlock Holmes was also used in a film in the 1960s, which is really a retelling of the disappearance of Lady Frances Carfax, meshed with the Ripper story. It was also used in the film Murder by Decree, which starred Christopher Plummer as Sherlock Holmes, and that film is based on ideas expressed in this television programme. Another story that was based on ideas in our Jack the Ripper story was From Hell, a graphic novel by Alan Moore. In this, he basically points a finger at a royal surgeon called Sir James Gully and suggests that he was a madman wanting to cut up women with the help of his coachman, who would drag them into the coach to be dissected. There was a television series in the 1990s starring Michael Caine as Inspector Abberline, who was the main investigator into the Ripper murders. That television series used this TV programme's ideas as a starting point and a justification of who the Ripper might have been. In looking into this, one of the most intriguing books I found was this one, Richard Gordon's book, The Private Life of Jack the Ripper. It is a fictionalised account. I think it is, in this case, it's a medical student of some description who is the Ripper. It's not any sort of firm Ripper candidate or any real-life Ripper candidate who is in this case. But the thing that intrigued me about this is that Richard Gordon is known for his comic Doctor novels, which was made into a very popular series of films, and he wrote sort of something like 20 Doctor books over the time. And he later in life he went into a few private life books. He does the private life of Jack the Ripper, private life of, I think, Dr. Crippen, and also the private life of Florence Nightingale, who, to my knowledge, didn't go around killing lots of people. Well, not deliberately anyway. Another intriguing book to talk about is Time After Time by Karl Alexander. This was made into a film starring Malcolm McDowell, Mary Steenburgen and David Warner. And in this novel, H.G. Wells is a friend of a doctor, and this doctor turns out to be Jack the Ripper. He steals H.G. Wells' time machine and heads into 1970s or 80s San Francisco and goes around killing prostitutes. And H.G. Wells has to use the time machine to go back into San Francisco and track him down and capture him. A personal choice that jumped out at me is a book called Whitechapel Scarlet Tracings by Iain Sinclair. Iain Sinclair is a very interesting writer for me. He is mainly a non-fiction writer. He writes what are known as psychogeography books, where he visits places and talks about their history and the way that their history has sort of affected the psychology of that particular place. For me, his best known book is London Orbital, where he walks around the M25, which is a motorway that goes around London, and it is full of lots of anger and bitterness, because it was written in the early days of the new Labour government in the late 1990s, and he did not approve of that government, and it's very clear in the book. And yeah, it is full of this anger and this, the idea of corruption and the establishment putting people down. So it's a very fascinating book, London Orbital. So I definitely want to read any idea he's got about the Whitechapel murders. The last book I want to talk about with fictional ideas of Jack the Ripper is a book called Jack the Ripper Case Closed by Gyles Brandreth. Gyles Brandreth is a writer and a sort of personality in Britain who is, he's always quite amusing and quite a lot of fun, but you always feel that you shouldn't like him too much. There's something off about him. It's not that he's not that he does terrible things, but you probably feel, no, I shouldn't be known for liking this guy. But he is always perfectly likable, and he is very knowledgeable. He's written a series of novels featuring the investigative talents of Oscar Wilde, and in this, Oscar Wilde investigates the Ripper murders, which is rather an interesting idea, and I definitely want to read that and see if it's any good. Now, as well as people fictionalising the Ripper case, other people have sort of written books which have an association with the Ripper, either because they've completely changed everything but want to remind you of the Jack the Ripper case, or because they just have the Ripper case as a kind of walk-on part in their novel. The first of these, and actually one of the first books to fictionally deal with the Ripper, is Mary Belloc Lowndes' The Lodger, which was written in 1915, so only about 30 years after the Ripper murders. This book is about a mysterious lodger who may or may not be a murderer, may or may not be Jack the Ripper. There is a classic Alfred Hitchcock silent film based on this, in which I think it is Ivor Novello, the composer and writer and occasional actor, who plays this mysterious lodger who may be up to no good. It sounds an absolutely fascinating book. It is a must read for me. The next book to read is West End Horror by Nicholas Meyer. In the early 1970s, Nicholas Meyer wrote a series of Sherlock Holmes continuations based on the posthumous papers of John D. Watson, as they are labelled. And West End Horror deals with Sherlock Holmes investigating a Ripper-like murder that happens in the West End of London rather than in the East End of London. Nicholas Meyer, after a gap of about 40 years, has started writing more of these Sherlock Holmes continuations. There have been a couple of that have come out in recent years. And he does seem to be a writer very well worth reading. His first book of his Sherlock Holmes continuations, The Seventh Percent Solution, was made into a film in the 1970s, and that film is pretty much worth watching. Another detective whose investigations are in the late 19th century is Peter Lovesea's Sergeant Cribb, and in his book Swing Swing Together, which is basically a bit of a spoof on Jerome K. Jerome's Three Men and a Boat, in this book, one of the plot points revolves around the idea that one of the victims may be a Ripper suspect, and Sergeant Cribb has to go and visit Inspector Abberline to see whether or not he was a proper suspect, and whether or not he was in fact the victim was in fact the Ripper, which is rather an interesting idea, but that's about as close it gets to the Ripper books. But of course, these Peter Lovesea's Sergeant Cribb books are an absolute must read, especially if you're interested in this kind of Victorian literature. And as you may see, it was made into a TV programme in the late 1970s, and that is very much well worth watching. Dan Leno and the Limehouse Golem, by Peter Ackroyd, is often also published as The Trial of Elizabeth Cree, takes the character of the musical comedian Dan Leno and has him investigating a series of Ripper-like murders, and which Elizabeth Cree, the main character in the book, also gets caught up in because she is suspected of killing. As you may see, the title, The Limehouse Golem, might give a bit of a clue about who the eventual killer turns out to be. But it's not exactly the Ripper murders, but they are similar to the Ripper murders. The last book I want to talk about is a book called Ritual in the Dark by Colin Wilson. Colin Wilson's a rather interesting writer. He features in the Mammoth book of Jack the Ripper stories that I mentioned earlier, with his own personal Ripper theory, but he wrote a book in the 1950s called Ritual in the Dark, which is a reimagining of Ripper murders but set in the 1950s in London. And from what I can see, it's very much a book of its time, has a lot of rather sort of unacceptable attitudes in it, but Colin Wilson is a writer who intrigues me, so I had to put him on this list, and it could be rather interesting. So that's my delving into Ripperology. Like I said, you probably don't want to read more than the 5, but you know, I got sucked in to this mire, or fell down this enormous bottomless pit into Ripperology, so I thought I'd tell you about it.